All right, we're diving into Ruth chapter 3, a story that's ancient, sure, but full of drama and intrigue, ready to unpack some wisdom.
It's amazing how these stories can still feel so relevant, even after all these years.
Right. To set the scene, we've got Ruth, a young widow, and her mother-in-law Naomi, also a widow. Times are tough for them.
Yeah.
And then there's Boaz, a wealthy landowner, but he's also their kinsman-redeemer, which sounds kind of like a fantasy novel, to be honest.
Well, it's a concept specific to that time and culture. Basically, a male relative was obligated to protect vulnerable family members, like widows,
Yeah.
and make sure their family line continued. It's a huge responsibility, just woven into their lives.
Okay, so he's not just some rich guy. He's bound by duty to help. But then Naomi, she comes up with this plan for Ruth, and it involves going to the threshing floor at night while Boaz is sleeping and uncovering his feet.
That probably seems odd to us, but it was really symbolic back then, a gesture of submission. It was Ruth's way of putting herself under Boaz's protection and appealing to his sense of duty as a kinsman-redeemer.
So it's like she's making a huge gamble, all based on this ancient custom and Boaz's character. Pretty intense.
Just imagine being Ruth at that moment, alone, in the dark, taking this risk.
I can't even imagine. But wasn't Naomi's plan a little, I don't know, manipulative? What if Boaz had felt pressured? Couldn't that have backfired?
That's an interesting thought, because on one hand, Ruth is being very vulnerable and trusting. She's putting her fate in Boaz's hands. But yeah, Naomi definitely orchestrated it. It makes you think about the line between asking for help and, well, kind of forcing it.
It definitely adds a layer of complexity, right? This isn't just a simple romance. It's about power dynamics, what society expected, and the risks women took to secure their future.
Absolutely. And it makes you wonder, how do we deal with those same issues in our own lives? How do we know when to speak up, when to take a chance, even when it feels scary?
Whoa, okay. I see where you're going with this. So back to the story. Boaz wakes up, sees Ruth. How does he react?
He's startled, of course. But his response is really important. He asks, "Who are you?" And Ruth, she tells him who she is and asks him to, quote, spread his cloak over her, basically asking for marriage and his protection.
That's bold. So what happens? He just said yes.
Well, not right away, but his reaction is key. He doesn't reject her or get angry. Instead, he praises her, talks about her loyalty to Naomi. He even gives her some barley, which was a big deal back then, a sign of good faith.
Interesting. So he's being respectful, but not making promises.
Yeah.
What does that tell us about him?
It shows his character. He's honorable, obviously moved by Ruth's actions, but he's also aware of the situation. He mentions there's another kinsman-redeemer, a closer relative, so Boaz has to be careful.
Oh, even more suspense. It's like duty, attraction, and possible conflict all mixed together. This is like a legal thriller meets a love story.
Exactly. That's what makes this story so good. It's not just about romance. It's about social justice, loyalty, and the struggle between what you want and what society expects.
This is getting deep. But hey, that's the deep dive, right?
Hmm.
So before we get too lost in ancient Israel, I have to know, how does this connect to us now?
That's where things get really interesting. We've got Ruth's vulnerability, Naomi's plan, Boaz's honorable but cautious response. These themes of risk, seeking help, tough social situations, they're still around today, wouldn't you say?
Totally. But we'll have to dive into that after a quick break. Stick around. We'll be back to see what Ruth chapter 3 can teach us today.
You know, thinking about what we were just talking about, it occurs to me that this story isn't just about finding a husband. It's about survival, really. I mean, Ruth and Naomi, they were facing poverty, maybe even starvation. Their whole future depended on someone stepping in and fulfilling this duty.
Yeah, that's a good point. It makes the whole romance thing seem kind of different. It makes you wonder what choices women like Ruth even had back then.
Exactly. And it puts Boaz in a very interesting position. You know, he's not just a potential love interest. He's the key to resources, to security, a whole way of life that would have been completely out of reach for them.
So the stakes are really high. It's not just about feelings. It's about basic needs.
Yeah.
But you mentioned something earlier about those complexities even today. What did you mean by that?
Well, think about it. We might not have kinsman redeemers now, but we still need other people for support, for opportunities, mentors, bosses, even friends who open doors for us.
Okay, I see what you mean. But doesn't that kind of make us all a bit like Ruth? Always having to figure out those power dynamics, hoping someone will decide to help us.
It's a really interesting parallel. It shows how important it is to not just take initiative, like Ruth did, but also to really think about who to approach and how to do it. Just like Boaz wasn't required to say yes. Not every opportunity or connection is going to be the right one.
Right, so it's not just about asking boldly. It's about strategy, reading the situation, choosing wisely who we trust.
Exactly. And just like Boaz, who was so thoughtful and took his time, we should be careful about how we approach people in positions of power or influence. Are we respecting their boundaries? Are we being sincere?
That's such a good point. It's
Mm,
easy to get caught up in what we want, but relationships, especially when there's a power difference, need that balance of courage and respect.
absolutely. And that brings us back to that idea of wise counsel we talked about. Naomi told Ruth to go to Boaz, but was that really wise advice? Or was there some desperation there? Maybe even manipulation?
Hmm, that's a really good question.
Hmm.
It makes you think about the advice we get today. Are our mentors really looking out for us? Or are they pushing us towards what they think is best, even if it's not right for us?
That's a crucial point. Discernment is key. Just because someone's older or in a position of authority doesn't mean their advice is good. We have to learn to figure out their motivations, their potential biases.
So, just like Ruth had to figure out the risks of approaching Boaz, we need to weigh the pros and cons of any advice we're given. Trust our gut, ask those tough questions, and make decisions that fit our values and goals.
Exactly. And sometimes that might mean doing something different, even if it disappoints someone we respect. Just like Ruth had to make a tough choice, we might face situations where we need to forge our own path, even if it means going against expectations.
This is wild. We started with this old story about a widow on a threshing floor, and now we're talking about power dynamics, mentorship, making hard choices in today's world.
It's amazing how these ancient stories still reflect our lives, isn't it? They show us human nature, the challenges of relationships, and the timeless search for security, for love, for belonging. And at the end of the day, isn't that what we're all looking for in some way?
You're right.
Yeah.
But before we get too philosophical, we still have stuff to talk about. We've talked about guidance, taking risks, those power dynamics. But what about that other big theme in Ruth chapter 3? Fulfilling responsibilities, like what Boaz was supposed to do as a kinsman-redeemer. How does that apply to our lives now?
That's where we get into the idea of social responsibility and our roles in our communities. But that's a conversation for another time. So we're back to this idea of responsibility. We've got Boaz. He's in this position where he could provide for Ruth and Naomi, but he doesn't just like throw money at them or make some quick decision. He really thinks it through.
Right, he's aware of his duty, but he's also considering what it all means, how it could affect other people. And like you said, there's that other kinsman-redeemer, the closer relative.
Exactly. It's not just about doing something, it's about doing the right thing, even if it's messy. But how do we apply that kind of thinking today? I mean, we don't have these official kinsman-redeemer roles anymore,
Yeah, that's true. It's not like it's in the job description.
right? But think about the roles we do have: friend, family member, colleague, neighbor. Each one comes with responsibilities, doesn't it? Even if they're unspoken.
I guess so. But it feels so much less, I don't know, formal than what Boaz was dealing with. It's not like there's a contract for being a good friend.
Maybe not a legal contract, but there's definitely a social one. We rely on each other, we build trust, we create communities by living up to those responsibilities,
Hmm.
even if they're not written down.
Okay, I see that. But doesn't that put a lot of pressure on us? What if we feel like we can't help someone? Or what if it's a sacrifice we're not ready to make?
Well, that's where using good judgment comes in, right? We have to know our own limits, our boundaries. We can't be everything to everyone. But even small things, small ways of showing support, they can make a real difference.
So it's about finding a balance between knowing what we should do and what we're actually able to do. It's not about being a superhero, it's about being a good person.
Exactly. And remember, Boaz was praised for his integrity, his generosity. Those qualities are still so important today. They build trust, make relationships stronger, and honestly, they help our communities be more resilient.
You know, it's amazing how this story, which seems so old and specific, can make us think about our own lives in such a powerful way.
It's the power of stories, right? They offer us this timeless wisdom, even if some of the details feel outdated.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up this deep dive into Ruth chapter 3, what's the one thing you hope our listeners take away from it?
I think it's this. Whether it's getting advice, taking a chance, living up to our responsibilities, it's about doing it with integrity, with an awareness of how our choices affect other people. Just like Ruth and Boaz, we're always facing choices that test our values and shape our future.
That's a great point. And for our listeners out there, if you want to learn more, I highly recommend reading the whole book of Ruth. It's short, but it's a powerful story that'll stay with you.
It's a story that reminds us, even when things are hard, there's always hope, resilience, and maybe even, a happy ending.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep searching, keep learning, and keep diving deep into the stories that shape our world.